Welcome, everyone. I'm Roy Idelson, past president of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict, and Violence, Division 48 of the American Psychological Association. For today's webinar in our series on resisting oppression and pursuing justice, our speaker is Professor Helen Neville. The title of her presentation is Resisting Racial Oppression, Advancing Justice for All. Lessons from Black Scholars and Black Social Movements. I live about 15 minutes from Philadelphia's Independence Mall. There you can find the Liberty Bell and, more importantly today, what's called the President's House. That's where George Washington lived and enslaved 9 people 250 years ago. Last month, the Trump administration, in yet another of its white supremacist authoritarian directives, removed the panels, the displays, and the video exhibits that referenced slavery and that provided information about the lives of these people. Last week, responding to outrage from a coalition of community members, a federal court ordered that these materials be reinstalled, and that process has begun. The Trump administration, of course, is appealing this ruling, so the final resolution remains uncertain. Reflecting on this and other similar assaults on collective memory, I so wish that George Orwell's novel 1984 was not so painfully relevant today. And yet, how better to describe this fraught era in the United States than with the words Orwell wrote 77 years ago. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. It is with these concerns in mind that I'm so thankful that our presenter today is Professor Helen Neville. She is the chair of the Department of Educational Psychology, a professor of educational psychology and African American studies, and a Center for Advanced Studies professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Neville is also past president of the Society of Counseling Psychology, APA's Division 17, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, APA's Division 45. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, and she is active in the Association of Black Psychologists, having served on their board of directors and having received their Distinguished Psychologist Award. Her research on race, racism, African American psychology, and radical healing has been published in a wide range of journals, and she has co-edited 8 books in these areas. Please, as we go along, post your questions in the Q&A box below, and hopefully we'll get to some of them before the hour is over. I'll now turn things over to Professor Neville with much appreciation.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? If you could nod, if you can hear me, but you can't hear the music, correct? Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I am really, really honored to present to Division 48 during Black History Month. And Roy, you've been a remarkable leader, and I just want to thank you, Dr. Edelson, for what you do in Division 48. For the courage you have shown and actions you are doing to hold APA accountable. I think that is incredibly important, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Before we go on, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge the indigenous peoples and original custodians of Turtle Island, or the lands we now call the United States. I am speaking from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which is the lands of the Peoria, Wayuu, Miami, Ottawa, Kickapoo, Ojibwe, and other nations. I pay respect to both past and elders, and I pledge to support my First Nations siblings in their struggle for sovereignty and self-determination. I understand that our joys and comfort in this country came at a price, including stolen lands and the stolen bodies of enslaved Africans, my ancestors, whose labor built the United States. Intergenerational healing starts with naming colonization and racial oppression and the injustices that have inflicted. Healing also necessitates the celebration of the contributions of those impacted by these destructive and dehumanizing forces. Any semblances of democracy that we have remaining today and in the future is built on the teachings and resistance of indigenous peoples and the people of African descent in this country. Healing is more than words and acknowledgments. Healing demands justice and action. I encourage us to continue to educate ourselves, to listen to Indigenous and Black scholars and leaders and elders and follow their lead. I'm going to start us off with really just moving and talking about what are some grounding assertions. These are values that I think will hold us today. The US is slipping into authoritarianism, in which people from the global majority are disproportionately impacted. We are living in unprecedented times that is grounded in a history of racial violence, exploitation, and dehumanization. So I don't, it just bothers me that people are moving on as if life is normal, business as usual, and business is not usual. There's a lot of pain and suffering happening. Black people and people from the global majority have always resisted. I think this is important. Black scholars and movements have consistently identified problems and worked for justice for all. We know that when we create solutions that are going to improve the lives for those that are most oppressed, it improves the lives for all of us. Justice, love, hope, and joy are key to healing, and that psychologists should and can play a role in the movement. I'm going to do some intentions. I'm going to focus on MLK's kind of words about the urgency of now, a time to act. I'm going to briefly talk about racial totalitarianism in the current moment, and that situates these three lessons from Black scholars and movements that I think can inform what we have been doing around these issues and where we need to go, particularly insights for psychology. And of course, I have these beautiful quotes and music embedded into my slides. And Roy and I were testing them out, and they're just not working. So we're just moving on to plan B. That's what we're doing. I want to start off with the words of W.E.B. Du Bois and his work From Dusk to Dawn. And as we know, Du Bois is considered, the founding father of really history and of sociology. He also is grounding his work in Black studies. And in this, he talked about one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. When I hear this and I think about he's reflecting on his life, this is autobiographical and his relationships, his social relationships in society, and looking at the relationships between racial relationships, etc. I can't help but to think about this contemporary moment and how it is impossible to see what is going on, to see people being murdered by ICE, to be housed by ICE, to be continued violence that is directed toward our communities, and not to feel some kind of way, and not to feel as though that my research and science should be directed to begin to address these issues. Here I had a clip from Martin Luther King playing, particularly underscoring his talk about the urgency of now. He discussed this fierce urgency of now in his March on Washington. And the quote here is from the Community of Chaos. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. There is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. I'd encourage us to think and reflect on those words as we think about how we want to address our slipping into authoritarianism, into fascism. What do we mean by, I've been playing with this word, racial totalitarianism? Racial totalitarianism, authors call it and connected to internal colonialism and other forms, but people have discussed this throughout the US history, but it looks particularly oppressive in this contemporary moment as we slip into fascism or authoritarianism, which is a type of totalitarianism. And so, what is a racial totalitarianism? It's a social political system where the state and dominant institutions enforce racial hierarchy through laws, violence, surveillance, and ideological control. And so, thank you, Roy, for starting us off with those powerful words and situating where you're located. And some of what you've talked about was the attempted erasure of the history of the United States. So, these are some of the additional ideological and structural control and violence that is happening now. There is the idea, and that I, talk about racial totalitarianism as being pieces of it. There's this denial and gaslighting, like refusing to name the genocides that are happening in Palestine or Sudan, suggesting that ICE raids are not racially motivated. We can talk about a whole range of other things. There's this idea about erasure. Um, these deal with targeted workforce cuts, removal of Black historical figures, DEI images from government websites, funding cuts of people I know, grants, etc., scrubbing references to race and queer identities and national park services, the executive orders dismantling any DEI efforts, defunding grants. The idea of not collecting data is a type of erasure that I think is particularly important. We saw in terms of the large in the 2025, the large firing and getting rid of Black employee bases, VA employees, which constitute 25, Black people constitute 25% of the workforce. We see that there is institutionalized racial violence, these race-based raids that have been happening that serve to terrorize our communities, immigrant communities, Black and Brown communities. And of course, we know that allies have been terrorized as well. We see visa status revocation, funding war and genocide, funding instruments of war that can incinerate people, racial surveillance and over policing, the registration and documentation plan that's coming down, drone surveillance used against communities of color. There's been examples around, but particularly LA, the scaling back of police transparency and police reform. We see again silencing, folding, and retrenchment in particular beliefs. We think about the preemptive rollbacks to DEI, and people are like, okay, we're not going to follow up on that. Economic exploitation and denial of wealth building. I don't know about you, but I am following these cells of these large building structures that are for ICE, in which people are making millions and millions of hundreds of millions of dollars. We're not figuring out where those are going. And then this normalization and lack of empathy, silence, there's apathy, there's the acceptances of these practices. These are all parts of racial totalitarianism. Well, how do we begin to supplant that? It involves working towards systemic change and solutions by targeting the root causes of racial oppression as it intersects with patriarchy, colonialism, slavery, as well as economic inequality. So what I'm going to do today, I began to think about, well, how is psychology responding to things? How have other people and systems and groups responded to what we call the changing same, meaning that there have all, since the founding of what we now call the United States, there's always been racial violence, but it has changed over particular periods. This particular timeline is not a periodization, but just something that reflects where psychology comes in. We know that we saw when there was a rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s, we see the establishment of the Frankfurt School, and from there we know that things like the authoritarian personality began to come up. And for those folks who don't know, it's a merging of Freudian kind of psychology, psychiatry, along with Marxism. Along this line, we always see Black resistance that sometimes are marked in this little timeline and others. In the 60s and before, we see Black freedom and decolonial movements. And from there, we see psychology responsive with Black psychology and decolonial paradigms, such as Fanon's work, which is in the 50s and 60s. We see continued social movements in the 70s and 80s, the development of Asian American psych, Latinx, Society of Indian Psych. And at this point, the 70s and 80s, we see this development of critical psychology. There's unrest abroad in Central and South America, a lot due in the US interventions. We see those social unrest lead to things such as liberation psych and social systems. After 9/11, the war on terrorism, we see Amina Sai, a focus on social justice, starting, this a rise in authoritarianism in 2015s and beyond, and now we see the movement for Black lives, other focuses on liberation, and then this idea about healing. That's just a rough. So I'm really going to encourage us to begin to explore further what way can psychology meet this particular moment. The three lessons that's going to couch or frame our conversation. The first piece is naming is key. Across all those periods, no matter what we do, we have to name the particular issue that we are confronting. Black scholars and movements have named and theorized about whiteness and racial and intersecting forms of oppression that really have given us language. I have here Ida B. Wells Barnett and her The Red Record. Most people probably know Ida B. Wells for her work, particularly around anti-lynching and going around the world really educating people about lynching. Here she talks about justice. The role of justice is to arouse the conscience of the American people to a demand for justice to every citizen and punishment by law for the lawlessness. And so we understand when it's applied to every citizen, every person living in the US, when we have that, it's going to impact those that are most marginalized, as well as people who are sitting with some privileges. Today, we talk a lot about whiteness, but whiteness was named and discussed early on with W.E.B. Du Bois. In addition to him, in 1903, talking about the problem of the 20th century, and probably what the 21st century is the problem of the color line. He also discussed this idea about psychological wage, and he put that into language for us. It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts depended on their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. And it's interesting, this was written, these words were written in 1935. I can see some parallels to some of the happenings in 2026. Building on this, an idea about psychological wage and the way that it hurts all of us, we see Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory. And I think his work, I want to evoke that because he's been so instrumental in couching some of the current debates here and what people are responding to. Black people are the magical faces at the bottom of society's well. Even the poorest whites, those who must live their lives only a few levels above, gain their self-esteem by gazing down on us. Surely they must know that their deliverance depends on letting down their ropes. Only by working together is escape possible. Over time, many reach out, but most simply watch, mesmerized into maintaining their unspoken commitment to keeping us where we are at whatever cost to them or to us. And thinking about here this idea about whiteness in this particular moment, I've collected some data about when we were during the national elections, the not this last one, but the prior one, and those individuals that voted for Trump were those individuals who endorse and embrace their sense of whiteness, who had a sense of hostility toward people of color, movement for Black lives, and denied the existence of racism. Those were the Trump supporters. So even if their class position would suggest that it would be better to have another candidate, their investment in whiteness allow them to vote against their class interest. So, and when I also think about whiteness in psychology, we see the importance, insights that folks like Janet Helms have provided us, and how she's naming whiteness at a time that other psychologists were not naming whiteness. That she, in particular, is developing a theory of white racial identity in the 1980s and getting a tremendous amount of flack for pushing white folks to begin to think about that they have an identity that is based within this racial hierarchy, and understanding and pushing that white identity develops via two processes: an internalization of racism and an evolution of a non-racist white identity. Um, so this is important to name that white folks have identities and where those identities are situating. We also need to name, and I think Black Studies scholars in particularly have been important of naming white rage. Carol Anderson, historian, if you haven't read this New York Times best-selling book, White Rage, it has particular relevance to now. And she's talking about white rage not as an individual rage, but white rage that comes from the group and as it responds through policies and practices. So the trigger of white rage inevitably is Black advancement. It is not the mere presence of Black people that is a problem. Rather, it is Blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. And so when we think about the spark of this white rage, the most recent white rage really came during a time when Barack Obama was elected president. And we started seeing some coalitions around wanting to change things, ensuring that Black people are in their place. And we've seen retrenchments on activities. One of the things that I'll be spending some time right now focusing on is naming racism. If we don't name things as racism and calling it racism, then we can't begin to look at inequalities. And I like to think about, uh, racism and racial oppression. That allows us to focus specifically on the structure and ideology. I'll talk through that figure that's on the top right in just a second. So the ways in which even the notion of racism becoming common in the American lexicon comes during the Black Power movement through the book called Black Power, Stokely Carmichael and Hamilton's book. And in that, they asked, what is racism? The word has represented daily reality to millions of Black peoples for centuries. It consists of the predication of decisions and policies on considerations of race for the purpose of subordinating a racial group and maintaining control over that group. Racism is both overt and covert, and we call these individual racism and institutional racism. That's what they're working with. It consists of overt acts by individuals which cause death, injury, or violent destruction of property, And the second type originates in the operation of established and respected forces in society. And thus, it doesn't get much, it receives much less attention than the first type. In just a second, I will give you an example of how that happens. And in some work that I did with Shalmar Thompson in the late 90s, we were really unpacking and reviewing the literature on racism. And here we really highlight these ideas that racism is both ideology and structure. It's an institutional mechanism or structural of domination and a corresponding ideological belief that justifies the oppression, and it's based on physical features, cultural patterns, that of those that differ politically from the socially dominated group. So we've been really good at naming that, and my colleagues Lisa Spanierman and Gioni Lewis and I have this expanded psychological model of racism. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but one of the things that I want to orient people for is to look at Black scholars have not only defined racism, but they've talked about the racism types. Many people follow the James Jones 1972 tripartite model, in which he talks about cultural, institutional, and individual racism. But we also know there's other kinds of racism, internalized racism, things that I'll talk about in a second, are colorblind racism, how people deny, distort, and minimize the existence of racism. But that's not only, it's not okay just to start to articulate that there's this issue and name the issue. It's important to also name that there are negative outcomes of this issue and racial oppression. Clark in the late 90s has this model that he and his colleagues, the biopsychosocial model, that begins to talk about the negative outcomes. Now, although the author was not African American, but there's some interesting work being done on weathering now, particularly among African Americans, that suggests these cumulative impact of racism on Black folks. On there means that Black folks, while Black don't crack on the outside, it's cracking on the inside. It's aging people, and we have chronic diseases that increases mortality rates more so than whites. And in this, a way of also emphasizing, Black folks and other people of color and people from the global majority are more than just experiencing racism and more than just the negative outcomes. That no matter what phase we're talking about, from enslavement to now, people resist. And it's important to tap into those sense of agency. And they resist through social movements, through individual actions, and through interpersonal actions. So let's just discuss some contemporary issues and bring those to life now. This first image above, I believe, is from Track Immigration. I know that other people in this space are mortified on a daily basis about the crimes against humanity that is happening and targeting immigrants in this community. We see that the majority of those that are targeted by ICE and have been collected by ICE are, they have no criminal record. And about a quarter have criminal records, but those are for minor offenses, nothing that would dictate the treatment that they are currently treating. We see this increase, the sharp rise by the tens of thousands of people being put in detention, according to some of the data from 2026. And, I'm sure other people are reading this. It's not just detention centers, it's the horrific crimes that are happening. This happened during Trump's first presidency as well. These are sexual abuse. These are people not having adequate food. These are other kinds of physical abuse, people dying because they're not getting medical treatments, etc. These are horrific crimes against humanity. So those would be some of the structural issues. And of course, there's this ideological piece to this about why are we, what justifies targeting immigrants? They're taking our jobs, they're not paying taxes, all these falsehoods, they're criminals, etc. Dehumanize immigrants. And the overwhelming majority immigrants are people from Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, but there's also a sizable number of other Black folks from those regions and other regions. More recently, and these we see this is kind of structural and leaning toward these kind of individuals, this incredible anti-Black racism that was reflected in the BAFTA kind of awards, where BBC, although they were under fire because they removed the comments about free Palestine from their BAFTA awards, but they kept in the slur, and granted the slur was from someone who had Tourette's. I'm not blaming the person with Tourette's, but the decision to keep it in with the N word with the R-E-R. And also BAFTA, though, also took out a homophobic slur. So they were able to take out other things that they deemed offensive, but not the ER. And then, of course, we see President Trump's portrayal, racist portrayals of the Obamas as apes. And what I noticed is that people can really get around seeing the horrific and racist portrayals of the Obamas as apes and naming that racism, and they have a harder leap to begin to think about what's happening with ICE and seeing that as structural racism. We'd like to reduce everything to individual interpersonal interactions and not see how they are part of this larger structure. So I've given a lot of my time in my career to naming this problem. And I just want to highlight some of the work that I have found about naming this problem of racism. And this is the work on colorblind racial ideology. In the work that I do, I see that I like to use these two quotes by Ida B. Wells and James Baldwin. The first is Ida B. Wells: "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And that is the role that I see that psychology can play, is to turn the light of truth on what is happening and to name it. And then James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be challenged, but nothing can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that is also this part of naming. Recently, colleagues and I, a while ago, a decade ago, had an edited book that looked at the myth of colorblind racial ideology. And recently, a few years ago, Jackie Yee, myself, Nathan Todd, and Yara Makawi did a meta-analysis to look at, well, in the psychology and related literature, what do we know about colorblind racial ideology? And there's two things to kind of keep in mind here. There's some ways in which folks have talked about colorblind ideology. One is this denial of race, and the other is this denial of racism. Denial of race, there has been some meta-analyses previously on the denial of race. Where I work from, I'm more interested in denial of racism. I think that is the much more dangerous issue. I don't care if people see me if I'm Black or not, but I do care if they recognize and acknowledge racism. And if they don't, it is connected to this ideology of the status quo. If you don't think racism exists, then Black people are to blame, or immigrants who could be Black or Latinx or are to blame for their particular predicament. And as we had hypothesized and expected, the more that people deny, distort, and minimize the existence of racism, that was linked to greater levels of anti-Black prejudice. So people might think that it's a good thing, but it's actually masking racism. It is linked to greater legitimizing ideologies. Think about belief in a just world, things that say that the world is fair and just, and if you're not getting ahead, it's because something that you are doing. And also, when people deny and distort the existence of racism, that is related to lower levels of engagement in racially and social justice kind of work. Things supporting DEI, attending rallies and marches, support for affirmative action, etc. One of the things that we've also been doing, in addition to naming, we have to name issues, and then we have to figure out how those change. What kinds of activities can we engage in to help educate people in naming racism as an issue? And that, for me, has been to challenge colorblind racial ideology. So this naming racism or challenging colorblind ideology, what we have found when we followed college students over 4 years is we have found taking courses help people name and challenge racism, right? So the more courses that people take, the deeper their decline in colorblind ideology. Well, it's no wonder that there's all these policies and laws trying to take out naming race, racism, and their corollaries, because those are powerful in creating people taking social justice action change. And also the second thing that we have found is having Black friends. That humanizes folks, but it's a shame that Black folks would have to humanize ourselves. I'm glad that there are some newer research that talks about you can have uh, um, friends through social media, other friends, so it doesn't have to be you interacting. Um, we also know that empathy matters as well. We did some work with a former student and colleague, Andy Lee, and then also Mike Schlosser, Maria Valgoy, and Sundiata Chajua, where we're working with police officers so that police recruits, so they can humanize folks so they're not killing us, right? And one of the questions that we had is, if we educate people about colorblind racial ideology, if we just have them, understand and name racism, will that increase people's empathy or not, or is it the other way around? And what we actually found is that empathy was a driver in this. So these police recruits participated in 10 hours of critical race in theory um, education over a course of 10 weeks or so. And what we found is that their ethnocultural empathy, their empathy toward differences and people different than themselves, predicted their colorblind racial beliefs at time two. So the more empathic they were, the more that they had lower colorblind beliefs. But that was really read through Black friends. That was mediated. Having Black friends helped account for or explain that association. So empathy is critical. And actually, empathy drives this idea about their for getting people to name and see racism. One of the things, this is going to transition right now between what I'm talking about in this research about naming to then our second lesson that we've learned from Black scholars and Black movements. So what I've been trying to do is to situate that we've got Black movements and Black scholars have been naming things, so we have lessons, and then how I've been trying to contribute or build on that discourse. So I'm not saying, oh, I'm a Black scholar doing this, but it's a Black scholar in this discourse who is engaging in these literature bases. So with some colleagues, Mahogany Monet, Jarrett Lewis, and Salman Safir, we have this American psychologist piece that came out in 2024, where now we want to shift the gaze from racism to healing from racism. And what we did here was we surveyed 5 psychology journals that publish the most on racism. And we identified 372 articles, but the catch here is the articles actually had to name racism or racial oppression. We can't be, using a euphemism, because if you are, then you're not talking about racism. There's a couple. Oh, I had a song there. We gonna be all right, to highlight this idea about strengths, to highlight the fact that these are horrific things we experience and that there are strengths that we have as well. Couple things that I want to show here. On the left-hand side, we see that race mattered. So we see that there's an increase in topic areas and articles published, particularly about the experiences of racism. So those articles were articles on people from the global majority, Black folks, Indigenous folks, etc. And so we see an increase, particularly an increase and a rise after the Trump's first term. The research that on white folks that were included deal with things like colorblind racial ideology or dealing with racial beliefs, etc. On the right-hand side, we see also more of a temporal trends in the proportional application of racism theories. This is particularly important because you can see that still, even this since 2013 to now, people aren't using, they're not including a theory on racism. They'll just assume people know what racism is. And if they do include a theory, we see they're including theories by Black folks. Clark et al.'s theory or Shelley Harrell's theory. We see a rise in things like intersectionality theory, racial identity, racism stress, internalized racism, racial socialization. These are all coming from Black folks and Black scholarship trying to describe the particular moment. And that little gray dot at the end there is on the racism and healing theory. And these are also emerging from movements as well as Black scholarship. And I think that's where the trend is that I think it's particularly important that that psychologists use time and energy in that way. There's all kinds of ways in which people and Black scholars and movements are naming. They name racial capitalism, gendered racial migrations, radical healing, critical race theory, Black joy, anti-Black oppression. These are all ways in which we continue to name our realities and that are important. Lesson 2, justice is healing. We learn this from the social movement. Justice, love, hope, and joy are essential ingredients for the healing process. Hole Soyinka has this quote that I think is really powerful. For me, justice is the first condition of humanity. I had this quote here and another quotation from MLK. But during the civil rights movement and what emerges from there is MLK and others are beginning to think about a beloved community. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. And this beloved community is really about racial healing. And here he's dealing with how do we transform a society where Black folks, Black folks, white folks, Latinx, Indigenous folks, Asian American folks, MENA folks, people across genders, where can we create a society in which we can get along and healing happens, where we looked at as wholeness? So he talks about coming into full power, things related to repairing harm, etc. So we see this coming from the civil rights movement, this focus on healing.
Yeah.
We also see, and I'm so disappointed that you all can't listen to Bell Hook's words, but I do encourage you to read her book, All About Love. And Bell Hooks picks up on the writings of MLK and other folks. And here she talks about the importance of love. We're a love ethnic, informing all public policy in cities and towns. Individuals would come together and map out programs that would affect the good of everyone. So we really see coming through this healing piece here, this beloved community piece, and this radical love that creating these environments. Even she and others would talk about protests as an act of love because it's an investment in one's community. So what I've been doing, I'm gonna finish. I'm gonna speed things up. But what I've been doing in some of the work is moving from racism, which really is defining the problem, but those problems are dehumanization, to healing, which is the process of humanization. I have been so fortunate to work with leaders in the field like Lillian Comas Diaz, and Gordie Hall on a special issue in the American Psychologist that talked about racial trauma theory, research, and healing. So these are the ones that we're introducing healing into the mix here. Been working with students and colleagues around, well, how do we have healing methodologies? What do we do there? And then community psychologists around community healing and resistance, focusing on some cultural strengths like storytelling. I don't have, and I knew I wouldn't have time to talk about this, but I just feel horrible if I didn't talk or at least mention Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon was talking about this idea about healing during colonialism in the late 50s, early 60s, right? And I had the privilege of working with a Fanonian scholar where we brought these social political ideas into the contemporary moment that focus on healing. And there are these beautiful chapters by Smith and Gure that talks about subversive healing, focused on Fanon's thing. Marie Valgoy talks about this idea about healing and ways in which white folks can assist in this cross-racial trauma healing piece. And then Chioneso and her colleagues talking about healing at a community level and looking at Somali Canadian folks. I don't have time into discussing each of those critical components, but through Fanon's work, he provides a map way for us to look at how we think about personal, who we are, how we think about therapy and a therapist as healers, the importance of the political education and collective awakening during community society. These are all set in the 50s and 60s by, liberation psychiatrist Fanon. And so, more recently, been working in the psychology of Radical Healing Collective. We have ways in which we are thinking about personal healing and collective healing. Ideas about that include critical consciousness, increasing people's not only ability to name, but to understand and analyze systems of oppression, increase their efficacy, and actually taking action. And ideas building on the cultural strengths that we bring, ideas about radical hope, this belief that racial justice is possible in the future. And we have models to kind of describe that radical hope that's built on storytelling as well as empirical literature. So the difference between this radical healing collective framework and some of the beloved community and other frameworks is the beloved community that emerges from the civil rights movement is focused on healing for all, and the psychology of radical healing focuses on healing among people of color in the global majority. How do we heal ourselves? And part of that is fighting for justice, but it's not only that. And we see that there's been lots of articles, not by myself, but other folks that are beginning to research this perspective that's out there. And what we have found, we have been particularly focused on this idea about radical hope. We've looked at two dimensions of radical hope. One is this personal efficacy that I myself can contribute to creating greater racial justice in the future. And then a notion of collective efficacy that people in my community, Black folks, Latinx folks, in the Asian American folks, MENA folks in their community, they can work toward creating racial justice. And we've got a scale that we created. And what we have found is that when people have greater radical hope, they have greater levels of thriving, greater critical consciousness, greater satisfaction with life, and greater experiences of joy. So hope is really important in this moment. And I think, Roy, when you started some of your comments, you talked about having hope. I mean, we got to hold on to those things, because if we don't have hope that change is possible, then we slip into despair and inaction. For those folks who want to follow us, feel free to take a look at, we've got some resources. There's our handle or whatever you call it. One of the things that is coming up that we're going to do is this a Psychology of Radical Healing virtual symposium, which is April 17th. Save the date, follow us, and we'll be sure to also make sure that other people have the information through listservs. I don't want to go without talking about joy, because in addition to everything that we've had, Black folks do joy well, even in the midst of pain. And I think this is a gift. Clever Cruz has this Black Joy Project he started in 2015. And in 2018, we see something like the Black Joy Parade in Oakland, California. But Cruz offers this important insight. Black joy consistently runs alongside the suffering, pains, trials, and tribulations that we have endured throughout history and that we endure today. It's a battery in our backs that recharges and powers us through the worst obstacles we face. It is one of our most key yet unexamined tools for surviving this world. It is both resistance and healing, and it is needed to reaffirm and validate our humanity, even in the midst of incredible pain. I'm not going to really go through some of the joy work, but please know that I've been trying to think through what are the healing pieces of joy? How do we think about those?
I realize that.
Also thinking about joy, generally people think about individual joy or their personal joy, but there is also collective joy. I have this image here, which I think represents this collective joy. How joyful were people watching the last two um, uh, um, performances in the whatever it's called, the football game. That's all I want to say. And so those bring joy because it increases representation. There's music involved. It's a critique of the politics, etc. Here's a quote. I just gonna have a couple quotes that exemplify joy from Black women. Um, I felt a deep feeling of happiness and pride during a natural hair gathering I attended with my friends. Seeing so many Black women confidently embracing and celebrating our natural beauty was inspiring. This might seem small to some, but to Black women, this is a huge issue. It deals with authenticity, it deals with being seen, which are all pieces and components of joy and hope. Last is the last is struggle is necessary. This is important. There is no struggle. If there's no struggle, there's no progress. And power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. And this really is the challenge that I would like to have to psychology, that this struggle that organizations, APA and other organizations incorporate struggle as part of their research training practices in terms of how we can name things, how we can foster healing, which includes reparations, and how we actually engage in action and struggle. The naming of things, I want to return to issues of erasure, institutionalized racial violence, policing, surveilling, controlling, silencing, and normalization and lack of empathy. Those are things that I think psychology are well equipped for to address this racial totalitarianism and fascism that we're experiencing now. It demands that we have a contextual analysis, the ways in which Asian Americans, immigrants, Black folks are experiencing racial oppression are different. Our identities within that differ. We need to bring that sense of sensitivity. It demands that we work from an ethic or perspective of courage. That should not be radio, but radical love. And this courage is particularly important. I think it's cowardice when we back out of preemptively of DEI efforts. It's cowardice when we don't name things that are happening and feel like genocides, like racial oppression, like harm that's being caused. It demands that we move forward and join hands with others on this agenda. Many times people think that they want to create change just by themselves, and that's not how change works, and that's not how it happens. This is here's kind of how we were thinking about the urgency of now. There's a lot happening now. We are in a rise of authoritarianism, deepening, sliding into fascism. We need psychology to step up and not step back. And I'm looking forward to ways in which we can make that happen. Here's some of what I've been thinking about, but I want to save time for perhaps one question. I think I have time for one question if there's a question.
There is a question.
Great. What's the question? Bring it.
The question is there research that backs your point of naming racism when confronting it? And the person who posted the question has found that naming racism just shuts down the conversation with people because what they hear is, I'm a terrible person. And
Oh,
are there ways to challenge colorblindness without naming it racism, but just calling it wrong or unhelpful?
hmm. Oh, what a great question. The question I have is it's harmful for whom? From whose perspectives? Naming racism is healing for people of color because it's their realities are heard and named. What I have found is that some white folks call it harmful because it challenges them. So we have to think about from whose perspectives. So that's good. There are, I think, Daryl Wing Sue and Lisa Spanierman have some work about how to do this, though challenging and raising this particular question when you are dealing with white folks to reduce the sensitivity. The other issue, though, that I have is it's not just an interpersonal issue, that we need to also name racism so we know that it exists and there are policies that need to change in order to increase inequality, and that we're not falling back on blaming people of color for the inequalities. So it's complex, but there are people writing on that. Two people that come to mind are Daryl Wing Sue and Lisa Spanier. And of course, I encourage people to revisit Janet Helms, Dr. Janet Helms' work. Race is a nice thing to have. She really talks also about naming race and her WIMP model. So it's not easy, but we can't tiptoe around things. We have to find ways to have these challenging conversations. And yes, I have found that naming it can be a problem. Yeah, yeah. So I think I'll end there. Yeah.
Okay. Our hour has come to an end, but this was wonderful, Helen. So much valuable information, valuable insights. I'm really glad that we have recorded this. That means that I and others can return to, excuse me, what you've illuminated for us again and again. Um, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank everyone who attended. I'll remind people still here that we host a webinar every month on topics related to resisting oppression and pursuing justice. And if you're a member of our society, Division 48 of the APA, you'll receive a notice whenever these webinars are scheduled. If you're not a member, we'd love to have you join us. You don't have to be a member of the APA in order to be a member of our society. And you don't even need to be a psychologist either, just someone interested in peace and justice. You can join online at peacepsychology.org. Thank you again to Helen Neville. Thank you again to all of you. And goodbye for now.
Great. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.